Good morning again, everyone. This is Sunny Lou Williams, your MC for Practice Policy and Innovation in Mental Health and Addiction. I know we had a short 10-minute break, and I welcome everybody back. I hope you had an opportunity to get a quick stretch, get a few steps in. We are now starting off our third session of the day, History of Trauma and Cultural Suppression, LGBTQ+ Perspectives. We're going to start with Ms. Antoinette Hope, Director of the Office of Minority Health, Indiana State Department of Health, where she'll refresh us on an overview of national class standards. As we look at those 15 standards within a short summary, we do have a full technical assistance webinar that Antoinette Holt and Jeremy Turner conducted for us earlier this year. So for more details on national class, in addition to today's summary, please visit the National Class Standards as applied to LGBTQ+ from earlier webinar. We'll have those resources out to you later this afternoon. Welcome to Antoinette Holt and all our panelists. I'll begin with an introduction of Ms. Holt. Antoinette Holt is the Director for the Office of Minority Health for the Indiana State Department of Health. Her work involves specialized knowledge of state government, public health, cultural competence, diversity, health equity, and minority health concerns and issues. Previously, she served as the Deputy Director and Epidemiologist for the Office of Minority Health and the Office of Cultural Diversity and Enrichment. She has conducted research and led community outreach projects related to cultural competency and health disparities. Antoinette has been responsible for the execution and investigation of a variety of reports and studies focused on minority health concerns. Antoinette is considered an expert in her field and is often consulted and invited to provide valuable input on urgent matters that involved underserved communities within Indiana and the nation. She has been a guest orator at various local and national functions, conferences, and seminars in relation to minority health, health equity, and cultural diversity training. Not only has Antoinette committed her career to public health, but also embraced the field through her education, having a Bachelor of Science in Public Health and Master's in Public Health, and an upcoming doctorate in public health. Nationally, Antoinette sits on several boards and committees, and she's very involved within Region 5 Office of Minority Health Initiatives and Programs, and is the current president, or is the ex officio president for the National Association of State Offices of Minority Health. Antoinette, thank you so much for being with us today. We're going to kick us off with an overview of national class standards to remind our 210 attendees participating in today's session about the applicability of national class standards to cultural competency, and specifically how we can apply those to the LGBTQ communities that we serve. So here now, I'm going to pass you the presentation screen.
I'm going to accept it once I know what to do.
Yes, and a dialog box is popping up for you now, and simply on your desktop have your screen share, and we see your slide deck. Fantastic. And then after your presentation, I will do a short introduction of each of our panelists, and then I will invite them to do their own self-introduction using their own chosen self-identity language. Antoinette, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Sunny. I greatly appreciate it, and text her and all the people that are on the panel. Hello, and some of my lovely good friends. It's so good to have this opportunity. I promise to probably be the quickest person to talk about class standards in the time frame that we have. So if you have any questions, let me know, or Sunny will let me know, because I just see my presentation and not the whole screen. I mean, everything else. So we'll get started. Cultural competency is, everyone is familiar with hopefully everyone's familiar. If not, this is the big definition that a lot of people will use for cultural competency. The simple definition for me is, pretty much basically what makes you tick, for lack of a better way. The values and the principles, how you grew up. What, like myself, I'm from Louisville, Kentucky originally. You may hear a little drawl in my speech. Every now and then, I'll have to hold up the U of L sign against folks that are Kentucky or Wildcats. You may like Brussels sprouts compared to broccoli. These different things. There's cultural norms. Glasses is a culture. Again, everyone has a culture. If you're the oldest, the youngest, the middle child that felt neglected all these years, you have a culture. And so what we're trying to do when we're doing cultural competency is we want to value diversity. A lot of people, especially now, you'll hear a lot of people say, well, I am colorblind, or I don't see this. Everyone is everyone. But then if you are ignoring what someone is physically and what you find out in the iceberg, then you're ignoring that person. So we don't want to do that. We want to value diversity and inclusion. We want to continue to do self-assessments to make sure that we are in regards to being respectful of other cultures and people. We want to manage the dynamics of difference, as well as, we want to make sure that not just us personally, but the institutions and the entities that we work within are acquiring cultural knowledge on a day-in-day basis. So much is happening presently right now in the world with COVID, not only that, social injustice and different things. And so these are some things we want to make sure that we're integrating within the services and things that we do. We also want to be able to adapt. We want to be like a rubber band. We want to be flexible in regards to cultural context of individuals. You'll never know unless you ask. And there's nothing wrong asking. And that person willing to share about what their family is, their community, and different things will help you have a better perspective of the people you serve and the people we interact with. So what is CLASS? CLASS basically stands for the Culturally Linguistically Appropriate Services, and it was created several years ago by the National Office of Minority Health through the Department of Health and Human Services. And its intention is, again, that we're providing quality services for individuals that's going to help ultimately reduce health disparities and achieve health equity. Okay, and so there are 15 action steps that exist to CLASS. Now, CLASS is not a wonderful, sassy thing, let me just say. So I don't want anyone dozing off or anything in this presentation. And I promise I'm going to try my best to be as engaging with the time that I have left, because I have little time, to make sure you understand it. But CLASS is separated into 3 different entities. It basically offers the blueprint for individuals and health entities and organizations to make sure that your office, you are offering linguistically appropriate services, that you're doing and being in compliance in accordance to the law. There's a lot of changes that have just happened, and we'll probably cover that here that are affecting all the populations dispersed, those needs of individuals. We cannot always make something that's just blanket approach. We have to attune to those communities or individuals or people that we're serving. CLASS affords us that opportunity, and it keeps us in compliant. And then if you incorporate it in your policy, it will make you responsible for what we're providing individuals and people. So CLASS is about respect and responsiveness. We've talked about that. It's ways to improve quality improvement or services that we provide. Again, if we respect the whole individual and our populations we're serving, and we respond to their needs, then we're ultimately fulfilling what CLASS's ultimate things are. So hopefully what you'll learn from your staff or CLASS was gain knowledge about cultural values and beliefs of the people that you're serving. It may not be a patient. You may be in a different type of system, education, different things, whatever services that you're providing to the communities that you're providing, you want to make sure that you're adapting your services to that. You want to interact effectively with people whose cultures and beliefs are different than your own. So there's a lot of different things that I've had the opportunity to be exposed to. An individual that when I first came into the State Department of Health, she was Japanese, but she was from Brazil, and she lived in Brightwood. And so this was a whole different cultural perspective, and she introduced me to the world of sushi and all these different things. And there's a lot of things I would have never known had I not interacted with her. So there's just opportunities that you get a chance to do when you meet and learn and observe other cultural practices from people. You want to provide quality care that's respectful, not judgmental. We want to make sure that the services that support our primary languages, because we're having a language deficit. And what we do, I know I just talked to the Minority Health Partners meeting I was just in, and we were talking about those languages that were being used during COVID response, the highest being Spanish, but you have Burmese, you have Creole, you even have Arabic and different things. So it's important to know the communities that you're serving and what you may need to get information translated into so you can better serve the communities. And then finding out those cultural differences that are probably going to need to be addressed. So the first principal standard is the general standard of class. Going into our class standards, principle number 1, it says, you want to provide effective, equitable, understandable, respectful quality of care and services that are responsive for our cultural health beliefs, our practices. And so basically, this is the general overall premise of what class is. The other ones are going to get into governance, communication, and execution, but this is the general principle standard of what class embodies. The next 3 stanzas, or the next 3 objectives for class, is under governance, leadership, and workforce, meaning in regards to how we're going to advance our governance as far as our policy, our leadership, how we're going to promote class, how are you going to recruit and promote and support cultural and linguistic diverse governance. Does your agency, entity, program reflect the people that you're serving? Do you have people on your boards? Do you have people in the planning efforts that you're doing for programming? And then educating and training the governance. It's a constant. We are always continuous learning. The only time that you have learned everything and arrived is when we have left here on this earth. And so we are constantly learning each and every day. Going to our next portion is our communication and language assistance. And so again, like I said, we have a language deficit in regards to we need to provide the necessary languages. And also we want to do in communication, not just language, we want to remember those that may have certain disabilities, such as being blind or maybe deaf or hard of hearing. So we may want to provide ASL services, things in Braille and different things. So we want to make sure that we're offering the assistance to individuals who are limited English proficient or have other communication needs. We want to make sure, number 6, we're informing individuals of their availability of language services. I mean, if I come to you and I speak a different language, I'm going to probably, especially in a health situation, speak my first language because that's the most comfortable for me. That's what I'm most familiar with. And if I'm sick, injured, or have a problem, or they need behavioral health services, or dealing with the issue in regards to where I am being unjustly dealt with because of what I believe, or sex, or gender, or different things like that, then I'm going to speak what is most comfortable for me. So we want to make sure that we're ensuring we are giving people the necessary language assistance that they need. We want to provide easy to understand print. We don't have to talk in the sky and different things and these and that's and this, and we don't have to use these wonderful big $20 words just to simply say, I'm here to help you. So we want to make sure that our communication and language assistance is clear. And these class standards I can provide to Sunny afterwards. I mean, I know you had a presentation, but I can provide that also to you so you would have it and know it and be able to implement it in your own practices. The next couple of stanzas, which is going to lead, because there's 15, is going to lead, is engagement, continuous improvement, and accountability. We have to be accountable for the things we do. We have to be accountable for our staff, and we have to realize that what we do has an indelible impact in the communities and the people we serve. All right, so if we're establishing culturally, linguistically appropriate services and policies, and then so we're being accountable, we're transparent to the people we serve, we're going to be very successful in our planning efforts. If we involve the community in the beginning, when we are doing planning and programming or research and different things, rather than making people an afterthought, I think it's going to be very important. And we're going to have to do some tough things in regards to if we are accountable and someone that's in our staff is egregious and offends or does something that is unlawful. We're going to have to figure out a corrective action plan, and I think that comes a little later. But we want to conduct ongoing assessments of our organization. We want to make sure that we're right. We have to do a self-assessment as well as an organization assessment. We want to make sure that we're collecting and maintaining accurate, reliable demographic information. And that is something that we're working on at the state, where we're constantly trying to improve our data collection efforts, even in trying to incorporate different things as far as where we can do as far as gender, what we can do in regards to subpopulations for certain racial and ethnic groups. So we're trying to make sure that we are growing in that way of how society and our environment is going. We want to collect and maintain accurate, reliable demographic data, not just because we just want to collect the numbers, but it helps us. Data makes the world go round. Data helps us get our resources and money. Data helps us to show specifically who we're serving and what we need to do as far as making changes. Continuing on with our engagement and continuous improvement, we want to make sure that not only do we collect these regular assessments internally, but also how are we doing to the people that we serve. The plans, the services, and different things, we want to check in to make sure that, hey, what our original intent, has that changed? Because such as our environment change, our community could have changed, the policy could have changed, politics change. We're in an election year. There's a chance and a possibility everything that we have worked for towards, let's say the opiate epidemic and different things that our governor was a proponent of, could change if we got a new incoming governor, because simply they would have a different agenda. So how are we working with that? Because even on the city level, county level, what's going on with aldermen and councilmen and different things like that that may affect communities that we're in. What's happening if somebody is across the street from Marion County, but this Hamilton County and the services is over there, but I can only do it over here. How do we handle those different things? We want to make sure, like I had mentioned before, that we create a conflict and grievance resolution process. How are we going to handle those tough situations? And then lastly, we want to make sure that we're continuing to progress. We want to tell the good things that we're doing, the bad struggles that we may have had, and how we're overcoming that. So that's what's going to afford us the opportunity. So again, if you remember nothing else that I talked about today, class helps make sure service is respectful. It makes your services understandable. It definitely makes your service is more effective, and class initially helps us to get to equitable solution. So that is my presentation and a quick overview of class. I hope you got a lot out of that little bit, because I'm telling you, them 15, we could go all day on each of those 15 stanzas, but we have these wonderful speakers that we want to hear from today.
Antoinette, thank you so much for covering national class standards with us. You mentioned data earlier, and I wanted to share this with the panel and for all of our attendees. Earlier this year, we asked our community mental health centers and our opiate treatment providers to respond to an assessment on their key topics that they would be interested in professional development and technical assistance. Number one was institutional racism in healthcare, and number two, how to support LGBTQ plus persons better within the framework of mental health and addiction. So it's powerfully important that we always come back to national class standards in our services and in the quality of care that we are delivering. Thank you so much. It is my great pleasure to introduce our panelists for today. A short introduction, as each panelist will also be utilizing their own self-identity language to share what is appropriate and culturally competent to use as an example of empowering language for our mental health and addiction providers. So we welcome Jeremy Turner. Jeremy is the Director for HIV, STD, and Viral Hepatitis at the Indiana State Department of Health. We welcome Tony Gillespie, Vice President of Public Policy and Engagement at Indiana Minority Health Coalition. And we welcome Kristen Cooper, CEO, founder of the Startup Ladies. And we also welcome AJ Young, Director of the LGBTQ Plus Center at IUPUI. We thank you all so much for joining today, as our goal for this town hall is an opportunity for you to share your personal, professional, and industry and academic expertise in exactly how to empower LGBTQ plus persons by sharing your own personal and professional perspectives with our audience of mental health and addictions providers on bettering services, treatment, and support for patients that identify as LGBTQ plus persons. Thank you for your time today. I'll turn it over to Jeremy Turner first, then followed by Tony Gillespie, Kristen Cooper, and finally AJ Young for your self-introductions using culturally competent self-identity language. Jeremy?
Hi there, everybody. My name is Jeremy Turner. It's a pleasure to be here today. And, one of the things, it's always so exciting, but it's also humbling because I don't feel like I have, it's only my part of the story and who I am that I can represent as we have these kinds of conversations. And I think that our community is so complex but it's a pleasure to be here and to share about myself. As they said before, I'm the director of the HIV, STD, and Viral Hepatitis Division at the Indiana State Department of Health. In my personal life, I'm a former president of the Indy Pride Board of Directors. I used to be the vice president of the Damien Center, the largest HIV service organization in the state. And then more so personally, you know, out in the community, at work, I use he, him, his pronouns, but generally speaking, I'm also a former Miss Gay Indiana. And so among my friends and out among other people, people usually use other pronouns for me. And so I always say any pronouns with respect, I'm good with. Because out in public, if somebody calls me Jeremy and not Cass, among my friend group, it's like I'm in trouble. And so I have a nice kind of perspective, you know, coming from, you know, being that part of myself, but then also from my professional side that I like to share openly with about both. So as we have conversations today, if there are things that you're interested in knowing, I'll be real. Sunny and crew remembers our last talk together. And so I hope that this is a productive time for us all today.
Hi, my name is Tony Gillespie. I am with Indiana Minority Health Coalition. I'm the Vice President of Public Policy and Engagement. Him, he, his are the pronouns that I use. I just think from a community perspective, I'm originally from Gary, Indiana. Gary is not known as the gay Mecca. So growing up in Gary and going through all of the stages of my own personal development, I don't have horror stories, and I think that that is so much of the misconception that we have about communities, or, you know, from a racial and ethnic perspective. I grew up in a loving family, Christian-based, that we love everybody, and we still joke about that today, how geeky we are in terms of we have Zoom calls every Saturday. And, you know, over the years, my partner, my former partner, was part of my family. So, and while I think these conversations are so extremely important and everybody brings a different experience to the process, I think really the basics, and I appreciate Antoinette's presentation, you know, at the top of the list was respect. And then understanding of some of the other things. I think there are people who work in social services and work in human services and work in public health that truly have a burning desire to learn about other populations, other communities, other people, and really unpack and understand what goes on in their lives. And I think there are people who don't, and I think everybody is fine. But I think what often we I think often what we try to do is through trainings and education, we try to retrofit some people. They just won't fit, and that's okay. If you don't have a general respect of people and their differences, and not everybody does, and that's not a bad thing, that's just a thing, that's just real. If you don't have a general respect for people and their differences, you're not going to get any class standards. You're not going to get LGBT. You're not going to get pronouns. I have a coworker, and he is a great person, but he does not understand the pronoun thing. He doesn't understand it. And he said, "Look, I'm 65. I don't understand it, you know." And while I wish he would, I wish he could. I say a prayer. I hope he does. He doesn't, and that doesn't make him a bad person. So I think for me, what's so important is that as we go out and we create organizations and programs and processes, and I'm part of a totally different, has nothing to do with this, but they call it, they keep saying algorithm. It's a process. It's not like you spit into a mainframe and you get this, you know, preset formula on how to treat people. It's a process, and everything is a process in life. And so I think the biggest piece around the intersection of community and any sort of human services, but LGBT services, is there has to be a basic, you have to walk in the door with a basic desire to respect and understand people. And that leads you to, creating a trusting relationship. Or I'm not a social worker, but I've always been told that I have a heart of a social worker. They were trying to recruit me to be a social worker. But just the ease in gaining someone's social history, just having a conversation. My conversations never begin with I'm Black and gay and I'm proud. That's not who I am, and that's not all of who I am. I'm so much more. than that. But we have to find a common place to start the conversation. And I think that's the most important thing. Respect and understanding, and there are some people who don't value people and their differences the same way, and we have to be okay with that. That's my 10 minutes.
Thank you, Tony. Some really powerful reminders there of ensuring that we have inclusion and respect as we account for interactions with not just our clients, but really our coworkers and everyone that we come into interaction with on a day-to-day basis. Thank you so much. Kristen, if I can have you share and introduce yourself.
Happy Pride, everyone, and thank you for having me as part of the panel today. I want to share that I really didn't have to come out until I moved to Indiana. I'm from the East Coast. I lived in California for 7 years, and I moved to Indiana in 2004, and I was working at Butler University. I'm married to a man, however, I identify as bisexual. And really, it would be quite easy for me not to talk about my sexuality at all until there became an issue in our workplace where we had some members of the LGBTQ community who weren't comfortable talking about their weekends that involved people of the same sex. And so from there, I had a choice. Once I knew about it, I had to do a couple of things. So one, I came out to them. Two, I came out to my colleagues. Three, we began a safe space program. And four, I started working with Butler's LGBTQ Alumni Association. We created that with a whole group of incredible students and alumni. And then five, I worked with these incredible men from New York to create the first LGBTQ scholarship at Butler University. And so I went from really being who I was not something that was really that interesting to people to when moving here, it became significant because I passed as a married straight woman, and I had to share more of myself to make it okay for other people and to also normalize it within some of my white cisgender straight colleagues that someone who looks like you may not be totally like you. And since then, I've written about that story in the IBJ. Within my company that is called the Startup Ladies, we work to increase the number of women who are starting up scalable companies and fund them. However, the need was so significant for mental wellness support that we began a program that addressed a lot of the different problems that founders have, regardless of their sexuality. And so we implemented a program with psychologists. So if there are a number of psychologists here today, I would very much be interested in connecting with you because you are such an important part of the startup landscape. And we may not be talking about it in the numbers or in the platforms in business yet, but I think that's going to dramatically change over the next 5 to 10 years. The last thing I'd like to say is, for those who know me or know of me before they really get to know me, one thing that I think is really funny that people use as a way to say, hey, I know you're on the rainbow, you're in the rainbow family. People will just within the middle of a conversation bring up Ellen with me. And they'll be like, Ellen is so great. And I'll be like, yeah, she is great. And to this date, as much as respect and love I have for her, I've never actually seen her show. But it is a significant and consistent way that people bring up a lesbian that they look up to, share with me that they feel great about her, and that's their way of telling me, hey, I'm good with this. I know you're something on the rainbow, but I don't know what, but I'm good. So I appreciate that. So I think the fact that Antoinette is doing the training she's doing, and all of us are here sharing some of our experiences so that we can share some of the language that we use. I think it just makes it a little bit easier once we take the time to get to know one another and build relationships. And I'll end with the pronouns that I use are she, her, hers. And again, thank you for the opportunity.
Hi, everybody. My name is AJ Young. I use he, him pronouns, as you can see in my, I hope they're showing up in my name for everyone. I am currently the director of the LGBTQ+ Center at IUPUI, which makes me a professional queer person. And so it is very difficult for me to separate my personal identities from my professional work at this time. And so I often do start my introductions with the laundry list of identities that I bring with me. Which I will rattle off for you in just a second, but I think that's, I really appreciate you, Tony, bringing up the fact that it doesn't always need to start the conversation with that laundry list of identities, because sometimes that can get in the way of the intersections and the commonalities that we share if we sort of lead with this incomplete list of who we are. I am a sociologist by training, which I often joke is that is very much like social work, but without the feelings. So really thinking about larger disparities and identity. My specialization is gender and sexuality, so I think a lot about identity. I, of course, am the center director at IUPUI, so I've worked for in higher education for more than 10 years. If you're interested in thinking about LGBTQ+ data, especially around demographics, I would love to nerd out with any of you about that. I identify personally as a white, queer, transgender man. And so there's a lot of pieces in there. I think it's really important to identify racially as a white person, because that probably more than anything else colors the way that I move through the world, and really has impacted my experience probably more so than a lot of my other identities, just because of the initial level of privilege that I hold by being a white person. I very clearly identify as queer, but I also identify as gay. And in fact, there's the L is probably the only letter of the acronym that I have not identified with or do not identify with. And so the Q, the queer piece, really feels like it encompasses a lot of the different intersecting experiences that I've had in terms of gender and sexuality in my life. I am transgender, and I do identify strongly as that. And as the center director, I feel it's often very important for me to say that openly, because I do pass, and when people meet me, they don't often assume, they very much assume that I'm gay. They get that from my appearance and my affect and the language that I use, but they often miss the fact that I'm a transgender person. And so I think, especially in my role as the center director, it's important for me to be very vocal and visible about that. And I think another thing that's important for me, like Kristen mentioned, I think geography and sort of where I've come from and has been an important piece of that. I was born in Texas. I lived there for a very short time. I don't remember it, but grew up mostly in northern Illinois, just outside Chicago. I moved to the East Coast for 15 years to go to school, and have moved to Indiana about 2 years ago. And I would echo Kristen in her sentiment that my LGBT identity has become much more important in my move to Indiana, not just because I'm now officially, professionally a queer person in terms of my job responsibilities, but also the climate and the culture here. It does feel much more important to be visible and vocal about my identities in a way that it didn't always feel necessary or relevant in other spaces that I've lived in. And so I think I just want to add that as well. And I'm just looking at my list here to see if there's anything else I want to mention. I think just really highlighting that, you know, as Tony said, as Jeremy have said, you know, we all, including myself, represent our own individual experiences and can speak from those experiences, but the community that we are a part of and that I personally represent professionally at IUPUI is so incredibly diverse, and often the LGBT, whatever letter or letters we identify with, are not actually always the most important or most relevant or salient pieces of our identity at any given point. And I think that's also really important to recognize that sometimes the gender and sexuality, especially if that is one of few marginalized identities that folks hold, can become overly important in the eyes of other people, and that we are all very complex human beings as well. So I'll stop there.
AJ, thank you so much for your self-introduction, and also specifically for creating such a safe space at IUPUI's campus for our students who are still in the process of self-disclosing or in the process of simply just needing a safe space to have common culture and commonalities. When we get into the proposed town hall questions, we have a tremendous number of questions that have come in through the attendee line. I'm going to pass the question moderation over to Antoinette Holt and have her kick us off with some specific town hall questions around language, and then we will open it up as I send additional questions to her. So feel free to all jump in, or Antoinette, if you'd like to direct specifically, just really depends on what the question is. So thank you again, panelists.
Sure, I'll be glad to volunteer some of my lovely friends on the panel. Just starting out in regards to town hall questions, we know that, as Sunny Lou just alluded to, language is very important and is evident by the words chosen. Each of our panelists' introduction. The panel has shared helpful and appropriate vocabulary in their self-introduction. The vocabulary may be new to some and ultimately helps all participate in the conversation. What other vocabulary important from the LGBTQ perspective should we know? And how do we include that through language? I think also we may want to incorporate pronouns, because a lot of people are trying to understand pronouns and the use of it and different things. So if anyone would like to address that, I'd be glad to call someone out, but I want to give you an opportunity first.
I'll start.
All right. See, there you go, Mr. Gillespie. Go on.
I think the most important thing about language and labels is if it's, when I come in and sit down, or more so in a service provider role, when someone comes and sits down in front of me, I have no idea who they are and what their preference is. And so I think while the vernacular is important, again, I just go back to the basics in human interaction and communication. When you create an environment where it's an environment that that's not judgmental, and you can share information, people will tell you everything that you need to know and how to have a conversation. I think one of the most offensive things as a gay, Black, 50-some-year-old professional man is when people make assumptions about what they think or who they are and use terms that don't belong to them. And if you don't know, it's going to sound like you don't know. And then what that does to the communication flow is it's disrupted before it gets started. And as an individual, I'm offended by something that you said when you really didn't mean to offend me. You were just trying to create this open environment. So I just think the basics in communication, if we start there, we'll get to wherever else we need to go. I don't have a laundry list of terminology that I use when I talk to people. It's just, hey, how you doing? And you get started there. I do want to go back and add that I'm not sure how Kristen made it through life without watching Ellen, but applause. Yeah, so I just think, communication, I think sometimes we overcomplicate it, and while the terminology is important, and I thought AJ did such a great job in describing all of the things and all of the ways that he identifies himself, but if I were just meeting AJ for the first time, I cannot imagine we would get to that in the first 5 minutes unless he shared it. And so we just have to communicate. If you have a desire to understand and you respect people's differences and you use basic, polite human interaction and conversation that we've all been taught, that's the place to start. The rest of it comes. You build your relationship with the rest of it.
Well, and if I can just chime in too and add that, with AJ's background, I'm sure that he could give us an entire weeks-long class as we delve into how we use all of these kinds of things. And you know what? There's no expectation that everybody's going to know everything about this stuff. But when we're service providers, and I can speak, from funding a lot of services that impact directly the community that we're discussing today, our community, You know, we can do better at making sure that people are not forms. So whatever the government or whoever the funder is that's providing you the money to do your work, when you're sitting there with that person, you do not have to work off of the form and make them conform to the form. You know where people who identify in different ways will classify as you have to report that information. So you can build systems that allow open-ended ways for people to identify themselves without them feeling like they have to be classified a certain way, that then on the back end will manage your reporting for you. We've done something similar to that at ISDH with testing forms. And you know, it doesn't have to be as rigid as it can look sometimes if we're only focusing on, I'm funded to do this, I have to report on this, because that's what we all do. We're all under pressure. And, you know, I know that our mental health providers and substance use folks particularly are heavily stressed. And so if we break out of that mentality and we deal with the person, then we can make the system work for the person on the back end.
I don't know. Before we go to our next question, AJ, did you want to say anything?
Sure, and I can jump in and just do a little quick, Jeremy, you're right, at least a week, if not a whole semester on language alone. But just to address directly the pronoun piece a little bit, and I know pronouns are is a thing that's sort of the current trend, and I don't use the word trend belittlingly. I think it's an important thing. I think it's just the current wave of what folks are really latching onto, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
But the basic thing to understand about pronouns is really that at the core of it, sharing pronouns is about recognizing and acknowledging that the way that we perceive people is not always the way that they identify themselves. Right. And so I think, you know, Jeremy gave a great example of in different spaces, people perceive them in different ways and maybe use different pronouns. Folks look at me and they see and assume that I'm a man. Most of them, I think almost 100%. Folks happen to be correct in that assumption, but there are also folks who look just like I do, who do not necessarily identify as men and may use a they, them pronoun or she, her, or a different gender neutral or non-binary pronoun. And so really pronoun and asking people's pronouns or sharing your own pronoun is about acknowledging that the assumptions that you're making about people's identities based on how they look or how they appear in a space is not always the same as how they understand themselves. And that really is the core of it. And there are so many grammar charts, if you're interested in going back to fourth grade and doing grammar charts online of gender neutral pronouns, non-binary pronouns, and just generally on terminology. A resource that I'll share is Johns Hopkins University, their LGBT center, their LGBT services, has an excellent glossary available online. And so if you're really looking for a place to get started, that's where I would suggest, although there are literally thousands of other places to think about language and terminology.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I was just looking to make sure that I didn't miss any questions coming up in chat. My next question would be, during your self-introduction, you shared that each identifier required time for self-confidence and empowerment to share with familial or friendly community. How can our mental health and addiction providers and community organizations be an advocate for self-disclosure?
Be an advocate for self-disclosure. I think from an organizational standpoint, really actively sharing that desire to be that conduit, or that desire to be an organization that's open and supportive of that. But I think what's more important is, you know, being involved in some one way or another. There's nothing worse than for an organization to advertise, you know, we serve gay black men, and then there are no gay black men that work there. They don't have any gay black men on an advisory panel. They don't have any gay black men that they actually serve, but we're open to serve gay black men. And I know as service providers, we have to start. There's a place where we have to start, but the best way to engage community, whether it's around disclosure or any of the other important things, the best way to start is to include your target audience in what you're trying to build. Because if you're not part of that community, there's no tourist guide that can help you navigate your way. And again, and I think I said earlier that often well-intended providers end up offending people, before you get to any of the important things. And so to eliminate that, if you want to promote self-disclosure from a certain segment of the population, you've got to involve that population in that effort. A few years back at Indiana Minority Health Coalition, we did just a short study, but it was a precursor to we were submitting an NIH grant, and it was around disclosure. And so what we did was, rather than kind of plod our way through what we thought was the route to go, we convened a huge community group comprised of people from all different walks, including providers and community leaders and advocates and activists and actionists and moms and dads. And, we just sat around and listened, and we gained more information that way. And eventually we decided against the NIH grant, but we wrote a great paper that was published multiple times, where we just talked about the biggest way to self-disclosure is inclusion of the people because the reality of self-disclosure is, I want you to tell me your secrets. That's what it is. And if you think about how open are you to telling strangers your secrets, that would be not open at all. Which is generally, some people just like to talk. But generally people don't like to share their secrets. So how do I make you feel comfortable to get you to tell me your secrets? You have to tell me that. Is it the artwork in the office? And that seems trivial, but with a different hat and a different walk, I was the director. We started an organization in Gary, Brothers Uplifting Brothers, that targeted gay Black men for HIV services. So imagine how popular we were. And just to get started, we had so many different obstacles and people coming from different ways that were either intrigued and wanted to be included or offended, and we were going to hell. And things in our waiting room, we would do these sessions every month where we would invite our clients in just to, talk over lunch and tell us, what's working well, what do we need to fix. And they said, that picture that you have there, it looks like a church service. And I don't know what it is, and it was something clever that I thought was clever and abstract. But they said it's offensive. It looks like a church service, and my history and my experiences around church are not pleasant. So we took it down. So if you want someone to disclose to you, there's not a course. I mean, I guess there may be a course on disclosure, but that's not how you get people to tell you their secrets. You have to create an environment. You have to create them in the process. That's my spiel.
Tony, I think that just from my personal experience, I'm not a therapist, but when I was younger, my mom had taken me to a therapist and had asked me every way that they knew how if I was gay, like straight out asking me if I was gay, all kinds of different ways. And that was definitely not the way to do it at all. And so, because, and it was really interesting for me because I was going to bring this up, and I'm glad that you did, because when we talk about our past experience with trauma, when I was finally ready to come out and have discussions about how I liked other men, I thought that church was going to be a good place for me to do that for some reason, and it absolutely was not. I was called an abomination, Right. And so when I showed up just for this thing today, and I come in and there's a discussion about faith, I'm like, nope, I'm in the wrong place. This is not where. And then as the time kept ticking, and I was like, this is not where I'm supposed to be. And it just, I still don't feel comfortable even in open and affirming, because what my definition of faith was and all of that stuff. So if you're in here and you have that experience and you think about the coming out process as a person I'm from Evansville. I appreciate everybody that came from places where things were more accepting, but I think that, Southern Indiana, down in the hills and hollers down there, it's a place, it's a place to be from. And so, during that time, just being in those kinds of in situations, and reflecting on like what it took to come out, and then about faith. And so, it really is, and it's hard, because what I was going to, though, is that when you talk about matters of salvation or salvific issues, and you have to think about somebody, if they come from that spiritual place where they think, I'm going to hell if I am this kind of person, what it takes, it's not only the courage to come out and tell you, it's the courage about thinking that your entire salvation is on the line. And so I think that is something that is lost a lot of times. And particularly I think that, obviously not everybody comes from that background, but that was something for me personally that was a major, major holdup.
I agree. And I don't know if I responded correctly to the disclosure issue, but and I think between all of us, we can come up with 1,005 and a half ways of not to do it. But I think the most basic way, and I just want to reiterate, the most basic way, you have to involve the people that you are targeting in your process, and think of it as building a friendship. That if Kristen and I are acquaintances and I want to create a friendship, I have to model the friendship or the relationship that I want, and then it's a place that we have to get to want to braid each other's hair. I don't have any hair, but braid each other's hair and share secrets. That's just a place you have to get to, and it doesn't happen in the first office visit. It won't happen in the second. It will happen when I feel comfortable in doing such, and we have to build an environment to wait for it. One of the providers in our advocacy group and our research project, he just talked about strengthening the confidentiality forms that his agency used, and strengthening those forms and bringing in an attorney and posting signs about this conversation is completely confidential and it won't be disclosed, blah 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 blah. And the group response was, that is absolutely the worst way, because that's you telling me that have there been issues with confidentiality here? Is that something I need to be concerned about? You have to put it on the wall. You brought in a team of lawyers to so you can lawyer up. And confidentiality is complex, and organizational confidentiality is complex, and HIPAA laws are complex. What's not complex is I trust you, and I trust you with my secret. That's not complex. Complex, yes, but it's not legal complex. It's just a matter of, it's a place you have to be willing to work to get to.
Let me ask also this question that's come up in regards to some of our chat. We were talking about disclosure and self-identification and different things. There has been for years where people have thought using the word queer was seen as offensive or different things. And it's a little bit of confusion where now you have people that identify themselves as queer. Can you speak to that in regards to, so people will know specifically what to and not to do, or as to understand why that word's being used?
Yes, and I can take that one since I dropped the Q bomb in the conversation first. So queer, I'm going to try to keep this from a 1-hour lecture, so feel free to wave me off if I get going too strong. The queer is a word with a long and complicated history, and it is a word that even within the LGBTQ community, there is not agreement. There is a lot of mixed feelings, different feelings about that word. I will say, generally speaking, in broad brushstrokes, younger folks tend to be more comfortable and are more likely to identify that word than older folks are. And part of that is living through a time when that was the worst thing you could say to an LGBT person.
Right.
And that word carries that history of trauma, right? Even as language evolves and we have different words, or we take on and reclaim things, the words still hold those traces and hold that trauma. And so as a general rule, and I try not to do general rules, but I'm going to give you a general rule. If you are not part of the LGBTQ community, I would not use that word.
Ding, 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 ding.
If you do not identify with that word, even if you are part of the LGBTQ community, I would not use that word. If you are in a professional space where you are talking to people who are a mixed group, they are LGBT and non-LGBT folks, if you do not know your audience and it is not a self-disclosure of this is how I identify, I would just not use it. LGBT, LGBTQ, or if you're going to use it, know and be confident in being able to give some context behind it. But I will say that if we're thinking about self-disclosure and we're thinking about how folks are identifying, younger folks, especially folks who are coming out now, are more and more and more self-identifying with queer. And partially it is for many of the same reasons that I feel like that word is very close to my heart and my identity, is because especially for young people who being trans or being non-binary or gender identity issues are being talked about much more and are being more accepted in many places, those things are often tied up with our understanding of our sexual orientation, right? In our culture, regardless of how you identify, gender and sexuality are very closely linked in our understanding of those things and our perceptions. And queer works as an umbrella term where it can encompass both gender identity and sexual orientation. And so for me personally, I am a transgender person. I am married to another transgender person who's also a trans man, but I am attracted to folks of multiple genders. And because of the way we define sexuality of hetero or homosexual, which are often based on our sex or our gender identity, it just gets messy. And to try and explain all of those little things and figure out what it means doesn't necessarily make sense, and it's too much time. And so I use the nice umbrella of queer because it encompasses all of those different things. You will also a lot of times see queer in the names of organizations or being used as the queer community. Again, as professionals, I would tread carefully on that and be very mindful, and just, if you at all can, stick with the acronym, whether it's LGBT, whether it's LGBTQ, whether it's the LGBTQ plus. And I think that's definitely the safer and more inclusive and accessible way to go, because queer is still one of those words where you might unintentionally really harm someone in those first, 3 minutes or that first conversation, and then you have to go into relationship repair instead of relationship building, and that's a much harder place to come back from and build trust around.
Well, and I would just like to follow up with that bit by saying that, I appreciate that explanation so much, because, one of the things too about the broader use of queer in our community, which I have started referring to myself as queer, is because there's a lot of misogyny, and we have a lot of internal things happening. But, I think that as we have made progress in some areas where everybody's not constantly fighting for, equality as much, that then some people got equality and they're like, oh, hey, we're equal now. And then, right. But then that's not necessarily the case. And so, I think that by adopting that, it says, I feel like I am more than just a white cisgender gay man, and there are gender parts of myself that are involved in that. And I feel like when I am interacting with my peers, when I identify as queer, that kind of is it helps to better frame who I am as a person. And then one of the things though I did want to say is, and this is going to be, we talk about the younger people using queer, but when we talk about the older population, one of the things that I've experienced a lot of is particularly in that service provider capacity, thinking back to my days when I was doing housing case management or just HIV testing in general. And I don't want to use terminology that's triggering or bad for anybody, so I'm not afraid to use it, but just to throw around other kinds of slurs that people associate with our community, that start with an F. And then you'd have older people, particularly I thought of an older transgender person whose journey was amazing, and they were, I'm 6'5", and this person's looking me dead in the eye and has lived her entire life as her true self. And then she comes into my office and she says, you know what, I'm just an old, and it's just, as a provider, if they see a reaction from you about that, then that's going to immediately impact your ability to serve them. So whether you have a 19-year-old person who says they're queer, whether you have a 70-year-old person that's calling themselves some kind of slur in relation to their sexual orientation or identity or anything like that, then I think that it's just good for us to know that when we're in that space across from that person that we're serving, is that however they want to refer to themselves, we're going to go ahead and let that happen. And then if you notice that there are some feelings wrapped around the language they use about themselves, maybe at a later point in time, that might be a good discussion to have. But just in that moment, until you get your relationship built, it kind of refers back to that very beginning. Let them identify how they identify. And then, you'll get there.
All right, thank you. I want to include my friend Kristen. So this next one's for you, my friend. In regards to how can those of us that are in community engagement work to help create safe spaces for members of the LGBTQIA+ community in areas where there may still exist some prejudice or stigma?
That's a really important question. So one thing I learned from Kit Malone, who is at the ACLU, is that in your business signature, if you include your pronouns, that explains precisely what AJ was talking about before, that you have the awareness and that you are purposefully trying to make sure that even your email communication is open to people of every gender, every sexuality. So that was so simple, but I changed it. And when I saw AJ's name, it reminded me I need to update my pronouns well, I have them updated on Zoom. I think this is WebEx. In regards to one of the things that I talk about a lot in the startup space is that if people don't notice your presence or absence, then you're not really part of a community. So if you decide that you want to be part of the LGBT community and you want to make sure that in a different community that the LGBTQ people are welcome there, let them know that you're involved with different activities. Maybe you'll have photographs or something in your office that lets them know that it's a space where they can feel welcomed. And then I'm getting a little feedback. The last thing I would say in regards to being a community leader and trying to create space that is both safe and inclusive is that you over-invite people. And I learned that from Brian Payne, who's the CEO of the ICF, that, for example, my company is called the Startup Ladies. However, we welcome all genders. So we chose that name because we are trying to eliminate a problem for women. However, every person from every gender will be part of solving for the gender disparity that exists in this space. So what is incumbent upon me as a leader is to, one, say it over and over again. We welcome all genders in everything that we do. And when we have events and programs, we have to go beyond and make sure that people know that they are welcome to participate, they are welcome to become members. So it's extra work. And it may require that you have a spreadsheet of affiliates or individuals who can participate and maybe share opportunities. But as the leader, you've got to be cognizant. You have to be in regular communication. You have to keep showing up in different communities, and you have to invite those from other communities into your community. And I think those are some ways that you can create safe people.
Antoinette, I think you're muted.
I muted because she was echoing, and I wanted to make sure that we weren't having feedback. Are there any trainings possibly that individuals that are on the webinar today that you know of that you could recommend to these community leaders that possibly they can have a safe zone training for their agency, and then they could train their staff and help?
Let me go first and I can rule myself out of that. I don't believe in trainings. You can't train people who are from another community to be part of that community. The way you create that environment is whoever it is you're trying to impact or reach or in-reach to or outreach to, you have to bring them in and talk to them. You have to take your leads from that community. Even in our work in building Brothers Uplifting Brothers, which our goal was gay men, serving gay men, FUBU, for us, by us, we still had to spend periods in bringing in different social groups, different guys who were leaders, guys who weren't leaders. We still had to understand how we were going to serve that population that day. And I think AJ's explanation about queer and who's comfortable with it and who's not, and when to use it, who's not to, that sums it up. If you don't know what it means, don't use it. As an old black guy, don't call me queer. That I think it's offensive. That's not who I am. That's not how I identify. But I understand the word, and if somebody else is, that's fine. So there are, you can't, and I know the intent of the question was not to find a gay training to sign up for. So I know that's not the intent, but so often that's how it can be misinterpreted. And so if there's a segment of the population or a segment of the population in a certain community that you want to serve, go into that community and as Kristen said, invite those people in and share, this is my house, this is what I do, this is how we identify, and we just don't know, and we want to get to know how we can better serve you. That's me. I don't believe there's training that does it. Now, I think there's a training you can go to that somewhere down the line you might get your feelings hurt if you try to apply some of it, but it's just like just learning how to talk to people. There's no training that sufficiently does that. There are, I think, sensitivity conversations you can have and being part of a conversation circle. I think there are organic ways to do that, but and that's just me, him, me. That's my belief. So.
Okay.
Tony, I think that's absolutely true. And you had said this the beginning of the conversation, and I said it the last time Antoinette and I were speaking, and it was about something similar to this. But yeah, the community is so diverse. I mean, you saw how many letters. I mean, I was the president of Indy Pride, and sometimes I don't know who thinks what letter means what, because it depends on who you talk to. And so I don't like to go down that rabbit hole, but the diversity in our community, I mean, good Lord, there would be no way that you could have a training. Now, you could do, I think it's good to have conversations. I think it's good to have those things top of mind and a part of things, but training, it's just not going to be, and it kind of points to what Tony said at the very beginning, is that not everybody is meant to serve everybody. And so you're going to be in situations where people just don't get it, and I am so frustrated. When one of the things, we have an identity categories up here now, and I don't see non-binary on there. And, that's one of the things that we are seeing people identify as non-binary. They don't want to fit within that male-female system. And so some people just really struggle to get that. And I actually said that to somebody at one point in time. I was like, you're just in the wrong business. I know that you're a gay, white, cisgender man, but if you can't get into this at this point after how many people have said it, then, you just need to go and not deal with people who identify like this, because you cannot serve them as a professional until you get more woke about where people are in their lives and what they want. It's a disservice to the community.
All right, I like to get more woke. All right. Yes, sir.
And I definitely agree that, you know, the core of what Tony and Jeremy have just said, that you're not going to take a 2-hour, a 4-hour, an 8-hour, a 1-week training and just know everything and being able to respond in every situation. But first of all, working for a university, I want to say something positive about trainings because that's my job. And but I think the misperception or the difficulty comes when people think, oh, I'm going to sign up for this training and then I'm going to know what to do, and that's going to be the end of the journey. And really, whenever I do trainings or workshops or whatever we end up calling them, I really like to start and make sure that folks know that this is the beginning or an ongoing conversation, that you're never going to get everything you need in this 2-hour. But I think also, you know, going back to the class standards of, you need to do some of that self-assessment, right? And part of that self-assessment is understanding where you have knowledge gaps and trying to build on some of those and reduce some of those. And I think trainings can be a good way to do that work when it is offered, and not put the burden unduly on folks who are already marginalized or already dealing, right? You don't want to have your clients be the ones that are always educating you. You definitely want their input, you want their feedback, you want them to be involved in conversations about the organizations and the programs, but you don't want to put the burden of training you on your clients. Because they have enough to deal with. They don't need to also train their providers. And so there are places that are open and offering things like that. And those resources you should absolutely seek out, with the knowledge that they are not going to be the magic fix for whatever it is. Indiana Youth Group provides some trainings. Gender Nexus, which I somehow neglected to mention that I'm on the board of directors for Gender Nexus, which is an organization in town that serves trans and non-binary folks. Indy Pride has a lot of wonderful events, and I also want to just say that it doesn't always have to be a capital T training, right? Showing up to events that are about or for LGBTQ plus folks or around LGBTQ plus history or issues is training, is gaining knowledge. And so showing up to Indy Pride events, showing up to events that other organizations in the city are doing are a great way to start building those knowledge gaps. The LGBTQ plus Center at IUPUI is really focused on training our own community, but I'm happy to talk personally about me and my expertise. I'm happy to do trainings and sort of outside of my role as the center director. And so, please feel free to reach out to me. And if not, I can start to connect you with some folks around the city. The Indiana NASW, National Association for Social Workers, does a great sexual orientation, gender identity conference every year that I believe is usually in February. That's an amazing opportunity to get some training around issues like this, specific to mental health and social work and things like that. So I encourage you to still seek out those opportunities, but absolutely know that that is not you're going to need to do more than that. That's not going to be enough.
Okay.
I do want to add, and Jeremy, thank you. I'm sorry, AJ, thank you for framing that so appropriately. I just wanted to add that another, this is coming from the field, and this is something that I learned by doing and doing badly. One of a couple of our clients, in our discussion, we kept talking about mental health. And he said, because I'm gay, I'm not crazy. Don't make that mistake. This is not a mental health issue. This is who I am. You guys need to, I know you're trying to build your organization, but don't miss that it's not a mental health issue because I'm gay. So, and that certainly wasn't what I was trying to purport. But it doesn't matter what I meant to say. That's how a few of the clients heard it. And so just in seeking, to be more edified and robust and more aware or more woke, as Jeremy said, that's just something that you have to be cognizant of and cautious about.
Very good. I just know that there was a question specifically for Jeremy in regards to how you shared your story about coming out. And so many people wanted to know, how can therapists better assist clients who are struggling with coming out? What do you wish the therapist would have done or have said to you that would have made you more comfortable or helped you in your path of life?
You know, I think that that's really hard, and I really don't blame. You know, I'm 30, I'll be 37 in September. And so this happened when I was 16, when I met with that therapist. And so they were looking at, you know, probably 1999, 2000 territory. And I think that things were a lot different culturally back then. And I think that they just didn't know really how best to do it. But frankly, coming out with your therapist is not the way you want to come out. I mean, I think that might be a way that it creates a lot of safe space for people sometimes to come out. But you know, I don't know that it's so much that it's almost, you know, they have that plant that smells like dead bodies that only blooms every 7 years or something, and the conditions have to be just right for it to bloom. The conditions have to be just right for somebody to come out. And so you can do all kinds of things with people. I think, I'm not a therapist or a counselor, but I could see all kinds of benefit that you can have without having to have a person tell you who they are, because, you know, I think that that's just a piece of things. And I think that I was having more trouble about how I was going to be perceived once I came out. You know, I was concerned. And, you know, one of the things was too, that my biggest fear was that I was going to be, you know, kicked out and isolated from my family. And then when I came out when I was 17, I was kicked out and isolated from my family, and I lived in my car, you know. So I think that but at the end of it, on the other side of it, it was just such a liberating experience. I mean, at that point in time, you know, here we were, and now I wouldn't be who I was without that. And so I don't know that it's so much of what you could do better to make it easier for people to discuss their sexuality. But and AJ or Kristen or Tony might have something else that they'd like to add to that, but it's more just, you know, finding that way that you can communicate with people that creates the environment for them to share whatever's going to improve their health, you know. And so I think that that's really identifying those opportunities. And then, you know, if you have a patient or a client that ends up coming out, and maybe they've been seeing you for a couple of years, it's not because you're a bad therapist. It's just because, you know, when you leave that session, where's your support? You know, I mean, you have that one session with them, and or you might have a session again later that week or next week. But, you know, really, I would really hope that people would find a way to have something, a steady thing in their life that they feel comfortable coming out and having some support from them, like on an ongoing basis, if that makes any sense.
Yes, sir. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am. And then we'll wrap it up with you, Kristen.
Jeremy, I think what you said is so important about how when someone reveals something about their sexuality in therapy and it's safe there, but what happens after therapy? And I would pose this question to all of you who are here. What are you doing to create spaces that are safe for anyone who comes out after therapy? What is a plan? Where do they go to? Where is a group or a list or something? Because I know I am an enormous fan of therapy, and my therapist has spent decades telling me to just be aware, and I'm always asking for homework. But when you are in such, and many kids or adults could perceive it to be a crisis because they don't know what will happen next. And if you fear being ultimately rejected by your family, friends, and church, where do you go? What community are you a part of? And I think that has to be part of the strategy and response from mental health leaders. After I tell you, what do I do next? And if they don't have that, they will suffer. So I hope you come up with some answers that help people who are coming out.
We'd like to thank Antoinette for moderating, and all of our wonderful panelists today for sharing their diverse perspectives. and some key takeaways that we should be ever mindful of, that LGBTQ plus is not one definition or another, but how the individual self-identifies. And that the only way that you can build trust as mental health and addictions providers is to have a conversation, not promote what you know, but promote how you actively listen, and also seeing the person and engaging in their current concerns. And so when we look at this from a mental health and addictions perspective, language is incredibly important. I reshared Dr. Dennis Rudnick's gender identities categories from earlier sessions yesterday, but as noted by Jeremy and AJ, when you look at self-identity, that is what your client chooses to self-identify as, and it is not right, wrong. It is what that individual chooses in his or her own self-expression. We greatly appreciate this wonderful conversation today, and thank you so much for all of our panelists in their ability to really hone in on the key context of LGBTQ plus populations in support of mental health and addictions providers, and also in sharing their own personal and professional stories. Thank you all so much, and greatly appreciate your time and efforts.
Thank you. Pleasure and honor to be here.